First, I'm going to lay out my rulers to create a parameter that will be 1/2 of the width of the fabric that I will be using. This particular muslin is 45 inches in width, so I am creating an area that's 22.5 inches so I can determine how much yardage of muslin I will need. The sleeves are often cut from the scraps, so the main thing to measure in this particular instance is the length and width of the body. And since the fabric is folded, I have folded the back piece because I only need half of the width to determine my yardage. That's a yard. Almost 1.5 yards. Okay. Having determined the length of the muslin that I'll need to cut the body of the garment, all of the pieces, snip and tear. Be sure to mark the length grain by putting arrows inside the selvage. The selvage determines the length grain. This way, when I tear the selvage off, I won't get lost and have to figure out which is length, which is width grain. Snip and tear the selvage off. Fabric cannot be blocked with the selvage on because the selvage binds it tight, so it can't be stretched back to be at right angles, length and cross grain right angles to each other. Now to block the fabric. Using a good surface for pressing and a good hot steam iron, Tearing the fabric makes the edges roll, so I want to make those nice and flat before I stretch it to block it back into shape. Because when fabric is woven and then put on a bolt, it often becomes somewhat distorted and has to be reblocked before cutting so that your garment hangs straight. Once you've pressed all of the edges, then fold the fabric in half, either lengthwise or crosswise. It doesn't matter. Because this is a large piece, I'm going to pin the edges together. It will help when I go to steam it to block it. I'm pressing the entire piece with steam, ironing it with steam, but I'm not putting a crease on the fold. Take the pins out. And now fold the opposite direction. This is a good sturdy muslin, and it does not need the same amount of blocking as some other less quality muslins do. This is a tightly woven muslin. It's real crisp. Now pressing, having the fabric folded the opposite direction, I can see that the corners and edges are meeting beautifully, perfect 90 degrees to each other. This is a blocked piece of fabric. As you can see, it's folded lengthwise. Make sure your pencils are very sharp. You always want a very sharp point when you work with pencils. Because of the size of this piece of muslin, I've decided to cut some of these pieces individually. I've snipped the length that I need of muslin to cut the front bodice. And now I want to determine the width of this piece. So I measure the width of the fabric and the width of the pattern to make sure that I have enough to cut a left and a right side. Since I've torn this piece away, I want to make sure I indicate which is the length grain. Again, so I don't have to waste any time figuring it out later on. If you notice, this time I'm going to create a crease. When I lay the pattern on top of this piece of fabric, the fold can be the very edge of the pattern. I'm indicating where center front is and the fold line for the interfacing and facing. Making sure that the bust and waist lines go to the edge of the pattern. It will be easier to determine the cross grains that way. And now I'm going to draw the cross grains onto the fabric. If you insert pins into the lines, as I'm doing, and then flip your fabric over, you'll be able to determine where those lines are on the other side. As you can see, I've put the very front edge of the pattern right up against the fold. When I pin a pattern to fabric, I pin relatively close to the edge of the pattern, not too far in. I want the edges to lay flat while I cut. Otherwise, the cutting may not be very accurate. Snip all of your notches, and remember there's only a little bit of a snip, about 1/4 of an inch. If it's in a neckline or any place where there's a 1/4 inch seam line, only about 1/8 of an inch clip. Otherwise, you clip through the seam line and weaken the garment. Connect the pins that I put through the cross grain lines, flip to the other side, and connect with pencil lines. This gives you your cross grain on the other side of the fabric. And the same thing with the center front line. And the second fold line, the fold line for the interfacing. Any of these lines can be marked. I've moved this up to where the line is. That line is actually where the fabric folds under. It will be the outside edge of the garment when the interfacing is folded inside. To mark the dart, I put a straight pin straight through the tip of the dart. Hold on to the pin in the back and pull the paper away. It will make a tiny little hole in the paper, but it won't cause any problems. I've made a little cross mark. This is the very tip of the dart. Connecting the notches for the bust dart to the tip of the dart, draw them in with your pencil. Just for my own reference, I'm writing in the seam allowance, exactly what the seam allowance is. 3/4 down the side, 1/2 at the armhole, etc. On the fold line, slice the muslin into 2 pieces. And now we have a right and a left side. Stack them together and put them aside. Now to cut the back piece. I'm going to show you how to cut this flat. Often things are cut on the fold, but that's not quite as accurate as cutting it flat, depending upon the thickness of the fabric. This fabric was well blocked before, but I'm folding it in half lengthwise and creasing it so that I can create a perfect center back seam. Smooth it out somewhat. You can press it again if you'd like flat. You'll still be able to see the crease. And fill that in with pencil. Take your pattern piece. Now, I didn't create my cross grains, but what I will do is measured down at each shoulder to make sure that the shoulders are the same distance from the edge of the fabric. With the fabric well blocked, the center seam perfectly aligned, and the shoulders the same distance from the far right edge of the fabric, this will be on the fabric perfectly blocked, perfectly aligned. What I'm doing here is just marking where the bust and the waist grain lines are so I can transfer that back onto the fabric. I'm marking the bust grain line so I can transfer it. With muslin, I do not usually determine a right or wrong side of the fabric. I use them interchangeably. Snip your notches. Marking the waist grain line. Checking all notches to make sure they've been snipped. I put my hand underneath the pattern to anchor the straight pin and then lifted the pattern away from it. You could also just flip it over and draw on the other side. and then transfer that. Checking for accuracy in the measurement between the bust and the waistlines. I did not think to put the horizontal balance line on the back pattern or muslin. So the horizontal balance line is usually about 4 inches below the center back of the neck. This will be your horizontal balance line. Filling in the seam allowances. Name of the model and shirt back. If you're working with many people, it's easy to get some of these mixed up. So I usually label each piece. Cutting the collar and the sleeve facing and the sleeve. Determining the length grain. Determining the straight or length grain line for both the sleeve and the facing. Transferring that line to the other side of the fabric. drawing a cross grain. Transferring the cross grains. Keeping in mind that the notch at the top of the sleeve is the shoulder notch. It is not the same as the length grain notch, and the reason it is to the right of the length grain line is that the back armhole measurement is longer than the front armhole measurement. I want to make sure that there is a notch at the center of the sleeve and the facing that matches it. I was running my fingers around the pattern. I want to make sure that there are no straight pins in the way of cutting, because if you accidentally cut into a straight pin, it will dull the blade of your scissors. Now, I have cut out the facing, but you'll see when I start to assemble this, I've decided later on not to even use the facing for the muslin, although the final garment will have a facing around the hemline. And it has to, because a hem that is shaped like this one on the sleeve cannot be turned up. You can't turn up a curve, so you have to create a facing for it. Clearly, I forgot to put notches at the underarm seam. Now to cut out the collar, the upper collar and the under collar. This orientation helps save a lot of fabric. Length grain. I still have so much fabric left. I don't really need to be as conservative as to cut them interlocked as I showed at first on the table. So just make sure you have enough muslin cut and blocked. You'll only need one upper collar and one under collar. This needs to be blocked a little bit better. Sometimes, even though fabric is blocked, if it sits for a while, it wants to go back to the way it was when it was on the bolt. So you have to reblock it before you cut it. Drawing a length grain line. Cross grain lines, perfectly perpendicular to the length grain line. What I'm doing here is determining this cross grain from the lower cross grain. I'm going up the same amount of inches on both sides from the first cross grain that I marked to determine this one. Because these are large curves, it's easier to cut one at a time. forgotten notches marked in. What I did was I put the two center backs together, because from the center back to the shoulder notches will be exactly the same on both pieces. All pieces have been cut properly, and now it's time to sew the muslin together to try on our